This morning I woke up to find my peaceful lake cabin retreat turned into a war zone, not because of anything I did wrong, but because I dared to use my own property the way I wanted to. The HOA president, a woman who looked like she bought her wardrobe from a garage sale and her authority from a cereal box, had planted a massive, private property no entry sign right across my gate entrance. When I called to ask what was going on, she told me with the smugness of someone who had never been challenged in her life, "The road to your cabin is now restricted access. You'll need to find another way in." Little did she know, she had just declared war on someone who understood property law better than she understood basic human decency. What happened next would make her regret every power-hungry decision she'd ever made. But let me start from the beginning because this story of revenge is so much sweeter when you understand exactly how it all unfolded. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm a 42-year-old civil engineer who has been coming to Pine Lake for the past 8 years. My cabin sits on a beautiful wooded lot overlooking the water, connected to the main road by what everyone in the area calls Sunset Drive, a narrow private road that winds through the forest for about half a mile before reaching the public highway. It's the kind of place where you go to escape the noise of the city, watch the sunrise over the water, and remember that life doesn't have to be complicated. The Pine Lake community used to be exactly what you'd expect from a lakeside retreat area. Neighbors waved when they passed each other on the road, people helped each other with dock repairs, and the biggest controversy was usually whether the annual fish fry should be held in July or August. That all changed about 2 years ago when Linda Cartwright moved into the biggest house on the lake and somehow convinced enough people to elect her as the first ever HOA president. I should have seen the warning signs when Linda started her campaign by complaining about property value degradation due to inconsistent aesthetic standards. This was her fancy way of saying that she didn't like the fact that some people had fishing boats in their driveways instead of keeping them hidden behind their houses. But I figured she'd settle down once she realized that most of us came to the lake to relax, not to live in some pristine suburban nightmare. The trouble started 3 weeks ago when I decided to install a small gate at the entrance to my property. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden gate that matched the rustic feel of my cabin. The gate was purely for privacy. I'd been having issues with random hikers and ATV riders cutting through my land to get to the water, and frankly I was tired of cleaning up their trash and dealing with the liability issues. The gate was clearly on my property, about 50 feet back from where my land met Sunset Drive. I made sure to check the survey markers and even had a local surveyor confirm the boundaries before I started any work. The installation was professional, the gate was attractive, and it didn't block anyone's access to anything except my private property. For exactly 2 weeks, everything was perfect. I could come to my cabin on weekends and actually enjoy the peace and quiet I'd been paying for. The random foot traffic stopped, my property stayed clean, and I finally felt like I had the private retreat I'd always wanted. That's when Linda Cartwright decided to make her move. It was a Friday morning in late September, and I had taken a long weekend to do some fall maintenance on the cabin. I was looking forward to 3 days of splitting firewood, cleaning gutters, and enjoying the spectacular autumn colors that make Pine Lake famous throughout the region. I had driven up Thursday evening and spent a peaceful night listening to the loons call across the water. Friday morning, I decided to drive into town to pick up some supplies for the weekend's projects. When I reached my gate to leave the property, I found something that made my blood pressure spike immediately. Someone had installed a large, official-looking private property "No entry violators will be prosecuted" sign directly across my gate, blocking my exit from my own land. The sign was mounted on 2 metal posts that had been driven deep into the ground on either side of Sunset Drive, right at the point where the road passed in front of my gate. It was clearly professional work, not something that had been thrown together overnight. Someone had planned this, acquired materials, and executed it while I was sleeping. I sat in my truck for a moment, staring at this sign and trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the sign was intended for somewhere else and had been installed in the wrong location. But as I looked more closely, I could see that the installation was too precise, too deliberate to be an error. I got out of my truck and examined the sign more carefully. There was no indication of who had installed it or by what authority. No contact information, no reference to any specific law or regulation. Just a blanket prohibition that effectively trapped me on my own property. I called the number I had for the Pine Lake HOA, which I had never used before but which was listed on the little newsletter that got mailed to property owners occasionally. Linda Cartwright answered on the second ring. Pine Lake HOA. Linda speaking. Linda, this is Marcus Thompson from the cabin at the end of Sunset Drive. Someone has put up a sign that's blocking my access to my property. Do you know anything about this? There was a pause, and then Linda's voice took on a tone that was both smug and condescending. "Oh yes, Mr. Thompson. The sign is there by order of the HOA board. We've determined that Sunset Drive needs to be restricted access to protect property values and maintain community standards." I felt my jaw clench. "Linda, that road is my only access to my property. You can't just block someone's access to their own land. Actually, Mr. Thompson, if you check your property deed, you'll find that your access is an easement, not an ownership right. The HOA has determined that unrestricted access is no longer in the community's best interest. You'll need to find alternative arrangements." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Alternative arrangements? What alternative arrangements? That's the only road to my cabin. "Well," Linda said, and I could practically hear her smiling through the phone, "perhaps you should have considered that before you decided to install gates and barriers that disrupt the natural flow of the community." The line went dead. I stood there holding my phone, staring at the sign that was preventing me from leaving my own property, and realized that I was dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. Linda had somehow convinced herself that blocking my access to my own land was a reasonable response to me installing a gate on my own property. But Linda Cartwright had made a critical error in her calculations. She had assumed that I was just another weekend cabin owner who would either give in to her demands or find somewhere else to go. What she didn't know was that I was a civil engineer who specialized in transportation infrastructure and property law. I had spent my entire career dealing with easements, right-of-way disputes, and property access issues. And I was about to give her an education that she would never forget. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse and spent several hours in the records office, pulling every document related to Sunset Drive and the surrounding properties. What I found was even better than I had hoped for. The original development of Pine Lake had been done in the 1960s by a small company that had long since gone out of business. When they created Sunset Drive, they had established it as a private road with maintenance responsibilities shared among the property owners who used it for access. The road easement was clearly documented, and my property had been granted permanent, irrevocable access rights. But here's where it got interesting. The easement documentation showed that Sunset Drive was actually built on land that belonged to my property. When the original development was done, my lot had been much larger. The developer had purchased a strip of land from my lot to create the road, but instead of buying the land outright, they had established an easement that allowed them to build and maintain a road while leaving the underlying land ownership with my property. This meant that I owned the land under Sunset Drive. The other property owners had the right to use the road for access, but I owned the actual dirt and gravel that the road was built on. As I sat in my truck outside the courthouse, studying the documents and thinking through the implications, I began to smile. Linda Cartwright had made the classic mistake of someone who thinks that having a title makes them an expert. She had assumed that the HOA had some kind of authority over the road, but she had never bothered to research the actual legal ownership and rights involved. I spent the weekend researching property law and consulting with a lawyer who specialized in easement disputes. By Sunday evening, I had a plan that was both perfectly legal and absolutely devastating. Monday morning, I called the same surveyor who had helped me with my gate installation and asked him to come out and do a comprehensive boundary survey of my property, with special attention to the exact legal boundaries of the Sunset Drive easement. Tuesday morning, I called a fencing contractor and got a quote for installing a fence along my property line. Wednesday morning, I applied for all the necessary permits from the county. And Thursday morning, I called Linda Cartwright. Pine Lake HOA. Linda speaking. Linda, this is Marcus Thompson. I wanted to give you a courtesy call to let you know that I'll be doing some construction on my property over the next few days. What kind of construction? She asked, and I could hear the suspicion in her voice. I'm installing a fence along my property boundaries. It's completely within my rights as a property owner, and I have all the necessary permits from the county. Well, Linda said, clearly trying to sound authoritative, any construction in the Pine Lake community needs to be approved by the HOA Architectural Review Committee. You can't just start building things without proper approval. I smiled. Actually, Linda, the construction is entirely on my property, so HOA approval isn't required. But thank you for your concern. We'll see about that, she said and hung up. Friday morning, the surveyor arrived and spent the day marking the exact boundaries of my property. The results were exactly what I had hoped for. The Sunset Drive easement was 20 feet wide, which meant that the road could be 20 feet wide. But the actual road that had been built was only 16 feet wide, and it wasn't centered in the easement. It was positioned so that there was 2 feet of my property on one side of the road and 2 feet on the other side. More importantly, the easement only covered the road itself. It didn't include any buffer zones or additional space for signs, utilities, or any other purposes. Saturday morning, the fencing crew arrived. I had decided to install a beautiful cedar privacy fence, 6 feet tall and built to last for decades. The fence would run along the exact boundary of the road easement, which meant it would be 2 feet from the edge of the road on both sides. The fence was completely legal, it was on my property, it didn't interfere with the easement rights of the other property owners, and I had all the necessary permits. But it would have one very important effect. It would make it impossible for anyone to put up signs, barriers, or any other structures along Sunset Drive, because there would be no space to put them. Linda's private property sign was mounted on posts that were clearly outside the road easement on my property. Once the fence was installed, the sign would be trapped inside my fence on my land without my permission. By Saturday afternoon, the first section of fence was complete, and Linda Cartwright came roaring up Sunset Drive in her oversized SUV like she was leading a cavalry charge. She screeched to a halt and got out of her vehicle already shouting. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching toward where I was standing with the fence contractor. "You can't build a fence here. This is a community road." I smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Linda. I'm installing a fence on my property, along my property boundaries. I have all the necessary permits and everything is completely legal." "This is ridiculous," she shouted, waving her arms at the partially completed fence. "You're trying to block access to the road." "Actually," I said, pulling out the survey documents, "the fence doesn't block access to anything. The road easement is clearly marked, and the fence is positioned to respect that easement exactly. Other property owners can still use the road for access to their properties, just as they always have." Linda's face was turning red as she began to understand the implications of what I was doing. "What about the sign? You can't fence in our sign." I looked over at her private property sign, which was now clearly inside the area that would be fenced. "Well, Linda, that's an interesting problem. The sign appears to be on my property without my permission. Once the fence is complete, you'll need to remove it, since it will be trespassing on my land." "That sign is there by authority of the HOA, she sputtered. I shook my head. "The HOA doesn't have any authority over my property, Linda. And you certainly don't have the right to install structures on my land without my permission." For a moment, Linda looked like she was going to have a complete breakdown right there on the spot. Her face went through a series of expressions: anger, disbelief, frustration, and finally a kind of calculating look that told me she was planning her next move. "We'll see about this," she said finally. "I'm calling the county and I'm calling our lawyer. This fence is going to come down." "You're certainly welcome to make those calls," I replied calmly. "My permits are all in order and everything I'm doing is completely legal. But I appreciate your concern." Linda stomped back to her SUV and peeled out down Sunset Drive, leaving a cloud of dust and gravel in her wake. Sunday morning, the fence crew finished the installation. The result was exactly what I had planned: a beautiful cedar fence that ran along both sides of Sunset Drive for the entire length of my property. The road itself was completely unobstructed, and other property owners could use it exactly as they always had. But Linda's sign was now trapped inside my fence, clearly on my property and obviously trespassing. Sunday afternoon, I called Linda again. Pine Lake HOA. Linda speaking. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Linda, this is Marcus Thompson. I wanted to let you know that my fence installation is complete, and your sign is now on my property without permission. I'll give you 24 hours to remove it before I have it removed myself." "You can't do this," she shouted. "That sign is there by legal authority." "What legal authority would that be, Linda? Do you have a copy of the court order or legal document that gives you the right to install structures on my property?" There was a long pause. "The HOA has the authority to regulate community access." "Actually, Linda, the HOA has no authority over my property or over the road easement. If you believe otherwise, I'd be happy to review any documentation you have that supports your position." Another pause. "I'm not removing that sign." "That's your choice," I said. "But after 24 hours, the sign becomes an abandoned structure on my property, and I'll dispose of it accordingly." Monday evening, exactly 24 hours later, I used my tractor to pull Linda's sign out of the ground and haul it to the county dump. Tuesday morning, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. "You destroyed HOA property." Linda was screaming before I even had a chance to say hello. "That sign cost $200 and you're going to pay for it." "Good morning, Linda," I said calmly. "I removed an abandoned structure that was trespassing on my property. If you believe the sign was there legally, You're welcome to file a complaint with the county sheriff. I'm calling the sheriff right now. That's fine. I'll be happy to show him my property survey, my fence permits, and the documentation showing that the sign was installed on my land without my permission. The line went dead. Wednesday morning, Deputy Sheriff Mike Rodriguez showed up at my cabin to investigate Linda's complaint. I had met Mike several times over the years. He was a reasonable guy who had grown up in the area and understood the dynamics of Lake community politics. "Morning, Marcus," he said as I met him at my gate. "I got a complaint from your HOA president about some kind of property dispute. She says you destroyed her sign and illegally blocked a public road." I invited Mike in for coffee and spent an hour showing him all the documentation: the property survey, the fence permits, the easement records, and the history of Linda's sign installation. Mike studied everything carefully and asked several pointed questions about the legal boundaries and rights involved. "Well," he said finally, "it looks like everything you've done is completely legal. Your fence doesn't interfere with the road easement, and if that sign was on your property without permission, you had every right to remove it." "What about Linda's claim that I blocked a public road?" I asked. Mike shook his head. "The road isn't blocked. I drove right up to your gate without any problems. And anyway, it's not a public road, it's a private road with easement rights. As long as the easement holders can still use it for access, there's no legal problem." After Mike left, I thought the situation might finally be resolved. Linda had learned that she couldn't just install signs wherever she wanted. The county had confirmed that my fence was legal, and normal life could resume. I should have known better. Thursday morning, I discovered Linda's next escalation. She had hired a private security company to park a guard vehicle at the entrance to Sunset Drive, where it met the public highway. The guard was stopping everyone who tried to use the road and demanding to see identification and proof of residency before allowing access. When I arrived at the checkpoint, a young security guard who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else flagged me down. "Excuse me, sir, I need to see some ID and proof that you have authorization to use this road." I showed him my driver's license and the deed to my property. He looked at both documents for several minutes, then called someone on his radio. "Ma'am, I have a Marcus Thompson here who says he owns property on Sunset Drive." "Okay. Yes, ma'am. I understand." He handed my documents back and waved me through, but the whole interaction took about 10 minutes and made it clear that Linda was trying to make accessing my property as difficult and unpleasant as possible. That evening, I called the other property owners who used Sunset Drive for access. There were 4 other families besides myself, and I wanted to find out if they were being subjected to the same treatment. The conversations were eye-opening. Not only were the other property owners dealing with the same security checkpoint harassment, but Linda had been pressuring them to support her campaign against me. She had told them that my fence was the first step in a plan to completely block their access, and that they needed to stand together against my aggressive expansion. Most disturbing was my conversation with Bill and Sarah Chin, an elderly couple who had owned their cabin for over 20 years. Linda had told them that if they didn't support the HOA's position against me, she would find other ways to make their lives difficult. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about my fence or my gate. Linda was using this conflict as an opportunity to establish herself as the unquestioned authority over the entire Pine Lake community, and she was willing to harass and intimidate anyone who didn't fall in line. That's when I decided it was time to play my final card. Friday morning, I called the same fencing contractor who had installed my boundary fence and asked him to come out for another job. This time, I wanted a fence installed along the other edge of my property, the edge that ran parallel to the public highway. Here's what Linda didn't understand about the layout of the Pine Lake area. Sunset Drive was the only road that connected the lake properties to the public highway. But the land between Sunset Drive and the highway, a strip about 100 feet wide and half a mile long, belonged to my property. It was part of the original large lot that had been surveyed in the 1960s, and it had never been sold or developed. When the original developer had created Sunset Drive, they had positioned it to run along the back edge of this strip, close to the lake properties. This made sense from a development perspective, since it minimized the road construction needed and preserved the most valuable lakefront land for building lots. But it also meant that Sunset Drive was entirely surrounded by my property. The road ran through my land via the easement, and the only way to get from the public highway to Sunset Drive was across more of my land. Linda's security checkpoint was positioned on my property, without my permission. Monday morning, the fencing crew arrived and began installing a fence along my property line adjacent to the public highway. This fence would be positioned exactly at the boundary between the public highway right-of-way and my private property. The fence would have one very important feature. A gate positioned exactly where Sunset Drive met the public highway. The gate would be wide enough to allow normal traffic flow, but it would be located on my property and controlled by me. By Monday afternoon, Linda had figured out what was happening and came roaring up to the construction site in her SUV, with the security guard following behind her. "You can't do this," she screamed, jumping out of her vehicle before it had even come to a complete stop. "You can't block the road." I looked up from where I was discussing gate hardware options with the contractor. "Good afternoon, Linda. I'm not blocking anything. I'm installing a fence on my property boundary. That gate will block access to Sunset Drive." I shook my head. "The gate will be open during normal hours for authorized users of the road easement. But it will prevent unauthorized vehicles from accessing my property." Linda's face was turning purple. "Unauthorized vehicles? What unauthorized vehicles?" I pointed to the security guard vehicle, which was parked on my land about 50 feet from the highway. "Well, for example, that security vehicle is currently trespassing on my property without my permission. That vehicle is there by authority of the HOA. Linda, the HOA has no authority over my property. That vehicle is trespassing, and I'm going to need you to remove it immediately." "I'm not moving anything," she shouted. "And I'm not going to let you block this road." I pulled out my cell phone. "Would you like me to call Deputy Rodriguez and ask him to explain trespassing law to you again?" For a moment, Linda looked like she was going to charge at me. Her fists were clenched, her face was bright red, and she was breathing heavily. The security guard was standing behind her looking extremely uncomfortable, and I got the impression that he was beginning to understand that he had been hired to participate in something that wasn't exactly legal. Finally, Linda turned to the security guard. "Pack up. We're leaving." "Ma'am, what about the checkpoint?" "I said we're leaving," she snapped. As they drove away, the fence contractor looked at me with a grin. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Tuesday morning, the gate installation was complete. The result was a beautiful wooden gate that matched the style of my fence and my cabin. The gate was positioned exactly at the boundary between my property and the public highway, and it was equipped with an electronic opener that I could control remotely. I programmed the gate to open automatically during daylight hours for any vehicle approaching from the highway direction. This would allow the other property owners to access their homes normally, without any inconvenience or delay. But after dark, the gate would remain closed unless I specifically opened it with the remote control. More importantly, the gate effectively made it impossible for anyone to establish unauthorized checkpoints, barriers, or other obstructions on my property. The entire area between the highway and Sunset Drive was now secure behind my fence and gate. Tuesday evening, I called each of the other property owners and explained the situation. I assured them that the gate would never interfere with their normal access to their properties, and I gave each of them my phone number in case they ever had any problems. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Bill and Sarah Chen were especially grateful, since they had been worried about Linda's threats and were relieved to know that she could no longer control access to their property. The other families were similarly appreciative, and several of them mentioned that they had been considering moving away from Pine Lake because of Linda's increasingly erratic behavior. Wednesday morning, Linda tried to drive up to my property and found herself stopped at my gate. I was sitting on my front porch with my morning coffee when my phone rang. "Open this gate immediately," Linda was shouting before I even answered. "Good morning, Linda. What can I do for you? You know perfectly well what you can do. Open this gate and let me through." I took a sip of my coffee. "Linda, what's the purpose of your visit to my property today?" "I'm conducting an inspection of the road conditions and making sure there are no safety hazards." "That's interesting. Do you have any documentation showing that you have the authority to conduct such inspections on my property?" There was a long pause. "I'm the HOA president." "Yes, you've mentioned that before. But the HOA doesn't have any authority over my property or over the road easement. If you want to inspect the portion of Sunset Drive that crosses my land, you'll need to provide documentation showing your legal authority to do so." "This is ridiculous. You can't just lock people out." "Linda, I'm not locking anyone out. The other property owners who actually live here can access their homes normally. But I'm not required to allow unauthorized vehicles to drive across my property for non-essential purposes." The line went dead. Over the next few days, Linda tried several different approaches to regain control of the situation. She called the county and filed complaints about my gate, but the county confirmed that I had every right to control access to my own property as long as I didn't interfere with the legitimate easement rights of other property owners. She hired a lawyer who sent me a threatening letter demanding that I remove the gate, but when I responded with copies of my property survey and easement documentation, the lawyer quickly dropped the case. She even tried to organize the other property owners into a coalition against me, but since my gate didn't actually interfere with their access and since most of them were relieved to be free of her harassment, she couldn't find any support. 3 weeks later, I received a letter informing me that Linda Cartwright had resigned as HOA president and was putting her house up for sale. The letter was signed by Bill Chin, who had been elected as the new president by unanimous vote of the remaining board members. Bill's note was simple and heartfelt. "Thank you for standing up to someone who had forgotten that leadership means serving the community, not controlling it." 6 months later, Pine Lake is back to being the peaceful retreat community it was always meant to be. The new HOA board focuses on organizing social events and maintaining common areas, rather than trying to micromanage everyone's private property. The annual fish fry is back on the calendar, neighbors wave when they pass each other on the road, and people actually want to spend time at their lake cabins again. My gate opens automatically for residents during the day and stays closed at night for security. The fence has weathered beautifully and actually enhances the rustic character of the area. Most importantly, everyone in the community understands that property rights are real and that having a title doesn't give you the authority to ignore the law. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them defeat themselves. Linda Cartwright thought she could use her position to intimidate someone who would just give in and go away. Instead, she picked a fight with someone who understood that the best defense against abuse of authority is a thorough knowledge of the law. And sometimes, the most satisfying revenge is simply building something so well-planned and legally sound that it can't be torn down by petty tyrants with imaginary authority. Today I'm sitting on my dock watching the sunset over Pine Lake, listening to the loons call across the water, and remembering why I fell in love with this place in the first place. The gate is open, the fence is strong, and the community is at peace. Sometimes that's all the victory you need.